Hey, everybody. This is Area Code Batavia, a podcast about what it means to belong in Batavia, Illinois. I'm your host, Richard Clark. Do you know the date Batavia was founded? Do you know the population of Batavia in 1932? Are you aware of how many total mayors Batavia has had over the course of its existence? Well, me either. Honestly, these kinds of facts and figures, often associated with history, don't excite me very much. But every now and then, I'll engage in some historical experience and become emotionally invested. I'll start to feel empathy for these people in the past, or I'll pick up some bit of inspiration for myself going forward. That's what happens when I visit the Batavia Depot Museum. And I think it has a lot to do with just how close to home it is. Even after I walk out of that museum, I haven't just learned about history. I'm living with it. For this episode, I spoke to the Batavia Depot Museum director, Kate Garrett, about how she helps to craft and maintain a space that's so close to home for so many people, especially as someone who, relatively speaking, is an outsider to Batavia, like me. So here's my conversation with Kate Garrett. It has been 50 years here at the museum, the Depot Museum.
Yes, it has. It's actually been technically longer than that in the generation of the idea, the bringing together resources and people. But 50 years ago, this year, we opened officially to the public. So we've been doors open since then for 50 years, which is awesome. Such a cool thing.
That's interesting. The idea of like, okay, there was a time before that where people were talking about the idea. And were they doing like a makeshift version of this? Or what was that? What did that look like, that time frame before?
Prior to the actual securing of a site, securing of a building in a location, the Historical Society has been around since 1961.
Okay.
So they've been around a long time.
Yes. I'm trying to do the math. That's like a lot of years.
It's 80 a lot of years, yeah. They just celebrated a big birthday right at the end of COVID, which made it a little difficult to get everybody together for it. But the society really formalized the idea that a bunch of folks had in Batavia of celebrating and capturing local history.
Yeah.
And that goes even farther back than the Historical Society to a fellow named John Gustafson, who you've probably heard about if you live in Batavia. At least the Gustafson name you've heard.
Yeah.
The whole Gustafson family and a number of brothers and sisters were very involved with education, arts, culture, history in general. And John Gustafson wrote a very popular series of short articles for the local newspaper that talked about historical topics.
Yeah.
So every week you'd get a little bit more about, here's the Batavia history of paper manufacturing. Here's the Batavia history of the Van Nortwick family. And the research that he did for those articles is mostly compiled in a book called John Gustafson's Historic Batavia, which first came out in the 1960s and is really still kind of the Bible of local history. I know you spoke to the mayor on an earlier podcast. So he has written the updated versions to that book since then.
Right. So we are currently having this conversation in the museum.
Yes, we are.
Describe the space and what it means to you.
The room that we're actually in right now is part of the Gustafson Research Center. I love how much of this building is fits and starts of new reinvestment into the idea of a community identity, right? This is really a place that people can come to understand what has led up to the moment we're in right now. I think that's an incredibly valuable thing to have just as a human being, whether you're looking at your local history or your national history or the history of your family's experience.
Yeah.
The room that we're in right now is our library and research center. So it's full of books that help people give context to events in Batavia. Some of it's really specifically about Batavia. We've got some unpublished monographs of researchers who've done work on, for example, the men who fought in the U.S. Colored Troop 29, the African-American veterans during the Civil War.
Yeah.
So we've got little bits of really specific information. And then we've got books about Mary Todd Lincoln and her experience in Batavia and things like that, more general availability. And that's the stuff that's out on public view. And behind us over here in that staff-only room is a huge archive of flat files, paper materials, letters, catalog books, all kinds of things that help document and explain Batavia history really specifically. So that's my favorite part, is getting
that's
into
the
the
stuff
archives.
you're sorting through, or it's like too delicate to put out.
Absolutely, it is.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, like context is such a big deal for how valuable something is.
Yes.
You go outside of Batavia, it's like, okay, this is just a random town with random stuff. But it's interesting when I mean this both in the general sense, this happens in any town, but I think it happens more in Batavia, where you are in Batavia and suddenly all this stuff is extremely valuable. Mm-hmm. Why is that so valuable here? Like, it does feel like, I think I was talking to Josephine Tucci at the library, the executive director. And she was saying, like, history is so uniquely important in Batavia to people. Why is that?
It did not take her long to pick up on that, did it?
It doesn't take anyone long.
I don't think it does.
It didn't take me long, for sure.
It's one of the reasons why my family and I moved to Batavia, is just that groundedness in its own roots and its own story, which I think is really unique in our area. If you think about a town maybe like a Schaumburg, which has had such incredible recent growth, and the history is much quieter there because everything's so new. In Batavia, we still have so much hanging on. I wish I knew why it was that way.
Yeah.
It will probably be the work of the rest of my life trying to figure it out or put words to it, put a name to it. But there is a real sense of continuity here. And the number of people who come into the museum who will tell me, oh, my grandma helped start the museum in the 1970s, or I will bump into names in the historical record and go, oh my gosh, I know their great-great-grandkid. Like, they still go to school here in Batavia.
Yeah.
There's a real sense of staying power here, like just solidness here, that helps people feel really connected to the things that came before.
Yeah. You moved here when?
2015, 20.
From where?
We were living in Aurora before we came here, about as far north and east in Aurora as you can get and still technically have an Aurora mailing address. So just south of Fermi. And we knew that this was an area we really loved and wanted to be close to the river if we could. And when we found an opportunity to move to Batavia, it's like, oh, that's it. This is the thing forever and ever now. So
you grew up in Aurora?
I grew up in Clarendon Hills, actually.
Okay.
And my kid's dad grew up in Western Iowa, really small community, almost to Council Bluffs. It's in Atlantic Iowa. So he was really used to like a small town environment, needing to travel really far away to get to things like a Walmart.
Yep.
It's a long drive.
Yep.
I was used to the suburbs. We met working at Living History Farms in Iowa, and then spent a little time in upstate New York, where we worked at the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Wow.
Which was very cool.
Yeah.
And then wanted to move closer to family when we decided to start having family. And Illinois is a really good spot to be. So found a happy home here and have been here ever since.
You moved here about 10 years ago. What was the first time you felt like you belonged in Batavia?
Oh, what a good question. I think for me, and this will not be surprising given like where we're talking and what we're talking about today, the first time I was like, oh yeah, Batavia gets me and I get Batavia is the first time the Depot Museum had a Preservation Week event and the mayor of the town talked about the history of the town. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a space that I can really feel at home and comfortable.
And now you know that is not a unique thing to happen.
I talk to people all the time who've had very similar experiences. And mayor talking about history is not a unique experience. That is the bread and butter of, I think, what a lot of people who are giving back to the community admire about the community is that it has these deep roots.
So it's interesting. It sounds like you finding out, okay, this is a town that cares about history.
Yeah.
Made you feel closer to the town. Is that just because you love history?
Yeah. My career is in museums and museum education.
Yeah.
And I did some work at Living History Farms and I did some work at the Baseball Hall of Fame and I bounced around a little bit. Worked at Klein Creek Farm for about 10 years before coming here to work at the Depot Museum. Yeah. Knew that history was a value, or a place that cares about its history is a value that I have.
What drew you to that?
I think I'm a big fan of story. I'm a big fan of narrative. I love plays and theater and movies, and I love reading books that have great narratives to them. And I think the narrative of what goes into a place and into a people is a real life great story. I think I like constructing those stories together, looking at lots of data points and seeing when somebody bought a house and how old their kids were on the 1860 census and what their kids went on to do, and like making some storyline of conjecturing what is the story of this person based on these really scant pieces of data.
That is so interesting to me because I have a love-hate relationship with history.
Okay,
and I think
tell me more.
I think it comes directly from how I was taught history growing up. Facts and figures, dates, concepts, sort of abstractly.
Yeah.
But I'm a narrative person. I'm a story person. And so there are times, I'll visit like a new city. I'll go to Washington, D.C. One of my favorite places to visit. And it is because you can feel the stories.
Yeah.
Like the monuments there, the museums there have a knack for helping you relive things. And just the idea of like, not literal, but historical ghosts in a town appeals to me, right? Like when you can feel the lives of what has happened before. That stuff I love. But there's something about the way I was taught that has left me with a weirdness around it.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating to me about what you just said is that you talked about the narrative, which resonated, but then you started talking about data points. So you have this ability to think about the facts and the figures. You're looking at facts and figures and you're turning those into narrative.
Yes, definitely. All the time.
Yeah.
It's that pattern seeking human brain thing, right?
Yeah,
where it's like, I just so happen to have found a path to that human connection through history, but you can get there in so many different ways. And I love seeing all the different ways people do that. For me, knowing those facts and figures, that sort of dry structure of history is a thing that it's a huge turnoff for so many people in their early experience of like learning how to do history.
Yeah.
And I think I got really lucky that when I was a kid growing up, my experience of history was places like the Field Museum, was places like I went to Living History Farms as a kid. And there is a special treat, a special pleasure that comes with a museum as that space that helps you make the connection between the data points and the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to come to the museum with a little something, that curiosity, but museums are great at building curiosity and pro-social behaviors in their communities. And they do it by making that data understandable.
Yes.
So
can we unpack that term you use, pro-social behaviors?
Pro-social behaviors,
yeah. Because I think everyone sort of has a sense of like, okay, museums are cool. They're probably valuable.
Yeah, right.
But why?
Yes.
What do they do for a community?
We really struggle in the museum field to articulate this in a way that is more so than just like, oh, you get good vibes. It feels good to be at a museum. Like, how do you actually measure it, right?
Or it's entertaining in a guilt-free way.
Absolutely. It's fun, but I'm learning something. So it can't be bad for me, right? So the museum field in general right now is doing a lot of work on trying to articulate the value of a museum. And some of it is looking at economic drivers, right? That like when somebody comes to a museum to visit, they're spending dollars outside of that museum that drives economic benefits for the community writ large. That's true.
Yeah.
It is really hard to trace those dollars. So we have some guesses what that number is, but it's not necessarily a firm number. We know that students who come to school field trips at museums leave with test scores that don't just measure their knowledge of a subject, but measure how patient they are with their classmates. It measures how attentive they are on new projects. It measures creativity. The Crystal Bridges has done a lot of really interesting work on this. That's an art museum down south. Okay. So they've got some great studies. There's some studies about wellness just in general and how people would value the experience of wellness that they feel they have attained through a museum trip. That's some new research that's coming out, but it's really hard to put hard figures to any of this. What we do notice is that kids who come on field trips are more patient with their classmates after a field trip.
Interesting.
That's crazy,
Why?
Right? We don't know. We don't know. There's some interesting data about the kinds of open-ended questions that get asked at a museum. You have to bring a lot to the table to get a really valuable experience out of it. The great news is that when I'm working the front desk here at the Depot Museum, very rarely are people here on accident or under duress. For the most part, people want to be here.
Yeah.
So the museum going public writ large is slightly more interested in the why questions behind things, slightly more interested in connecting to data points that feel like they're on really opposite ends of a spectrum.
Yeah.
And that curiosity leads to other kinds of, we call them pro-social behaviors, but leads to more patience, leads to more wanting to understand things from someone else's point of view.
Yeah.
The kind of thing that you're doing with Area Code, asking people questions, wanting to know their stories and what their life is like.
Yeah.
Those are the sorts of traits that we see pop up over and over and over again in the museum going audience.
I was going to say one of the things I think about a lot, I don't know if it's like one of my core values, definitely a value, is the idea of curiosity. In moments when you might disagree or not understand something, asking why can be really valuable. And you're right. Like you go into museums and that's fundamentally what you're doing.
100%.
You're like, okay, they kept food in this weird or whatever it was with a block of ice in it.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
And then you think about all of those things, you know. Or why is this grocery store? I was telling you the last exhibit I went to was the grocery store exhibit. So why is this grocery store not around anymore? And you ask why, and that leads to a whole bunch of thoughts and potentially actions that you would take as a result.
See, that's to me like the greatest compliment, because when we put together an exhibit, we're showing you a bunch of points of data, right? We're going to do some of the connections for you. That's the interpretation work. So that's what makes it different than just walking in and seeing a cash register in a display case. Well, here at the museum, it also has a little blurb about where it came from, who owned the thing. Maybe we have a photograph of the person who owned it, and that goes up with it. So we give you some context. That's what we call interpretation here.
Yeah.
And that's really the work of museum education, is that interpreting objects and artifacts. But we don't ask the questions. We want you to ask the questions.
Yeah.
So when I hear that you left with the question of, well, why did all these community grocery stores go away? Great.
Right.
That's perfect. We, gave you a little sample of a thing, and now you want to come back and enjoy the whole meal.
That's right.
That's exactly what we hope is happening.
You've been working in history and museums for a while.
Yeah.
Describe the moment you decided to move into this role at the Depot Museum.
I had visited the museum, been a fan of the museum since we moved to town, but had employment at Klein Creek, which was great. We did museum interpretation there, but more of like the living history flavor. So on a day-to-day basis, I was lighting a fire in a wood-burning stove and making bacon and scrambled eggs and eggs from the chickens. And so like a very different kind of museum experience. It's very hands-on, very immersive.
Yeah.
When this role opened up, I was super excited to jump on that right away and see if this was a good fit for the Park District as well, to bring me on board. I have loved every minute of working here since then. It's really such a treat and such an honor to be able to do my favorite thing, the thing I've learned how to do over the course of a career for the community where I live.
Yeah.
That's really unusual, and I know how special that is. So very grateful for the opportunity.
Yeah. When you started this role, how did you expect it would pan out?
I think what I was hoping to do with the role was to shore up the foundations of the museum. For many years, they'd had a wonderful curatorial and directorial staff here who were, for the most part, self-trained. Carla Hill and Chris Winter are still, their fingerprints are everywhere in this space. And they're such icons in the Batavia community writ large, and taught themselves how to do all of the work of running a museum. Like that's a lot.
Yes.
What I got to bring to the table was I learned how to do all of that at a school. They taught me how to do it. I've been doing it professionally for a long time. Is there a way that I can bring that training to bear to kind of shore up the foundation?
Sort of build on what they've
here?
done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, what a legacy that there are still people who come to the museum and talk about, when their grandma volunteered here.
Yeah.
There is such community ownership of this space. And I don't know that you would have gotten that if you hadn't had someone who was passionate about working at the museum and learning as they went, right? Like if you brought in somebody from outside who just had a bunch of skills and said, this is how you do museums. This will be the perfect museum. I don't know that you would have gotten the same foundational community building that Carla and Chris did.
A Batavian thing.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, it is.
Like the Peace Bridge and all of these things that we know Batavia of, but that feel fundamentally Batavian.
Yeah.
They all just sort of started like someone here said this should happen. And then a bunch of people said, yeah, let's make it happen. And then it happened. And then maybe you, again, like you said, hire outside to sort of make it sustainable and maintain it or better or whatever. But yeah.
No, that does seem to be a trend. And getting to look at the stories of history, the number of times that is the story is sort of jaw-dropping, honestly. Yeah. So, yeah.
You see patterns.
Oh, my gosh. Yes. And this is a huge one for Batavia. And I have not done the same kind of in-depth study for other communities. So I would hate to say that like nobody else does it this way, but I know Batavia definitely does.
Definitely does, yeah.
The museum itself is exactly that kind of example. It's a bunch of guys heard that that Aurora might take our depot building and put it in a park. And they were like, absolutely not. Let's raise some money. Let's get it together.
That's so funny.
And it just so happened that raising those funds, moving the building, fit within a need that was expressed by the district or by the community at large to have a place to keep our history together.
Yeah.
So
was there a moment where you started to like have doubts, like question whether this was the right thing for you?
I think that's a daily process of like just re-examining, am I in the right place? Am I doing the right things? Am I spending my energy in a way that is good for me and the people around me and my place in the world? So yeah, I think I hope that's not just a me thing. I think it's probably a lot of people who do that on a regular basis.
I'm sure.
You know, I have options. Is this still the option I'm choosing today?
Yeah.
There are definitely instances of feeling like this is a big job.
Yeah.
This is the weight of that responsibility of being the last stop in a lot of cases before an artifact winds up going to the curb or going to a garage sale. That's a lot to feel like you're responsible for. And the good news is there's a lot of people who care about it just as much as I do. So I'm never alone, which is great.
It's interesting to think about the stakes. I want to figure out how to say this. Like the stakes are high, but they involve largely inanimate objects or maybe even ideas.
Yeah.
Not so much people.
Yeah.
But they represent people.
I think you got it.
I don't know. It's it's like a weird concept. Yeah.
We talk about that a lot in museum work, is the idea of a thing serving as a placeholder for a people, a person specifically, or maybe a group of people. That in Batavia, we know that there are descendants of the Potawatomis who were here in 1832 before Christopher Payne moved in. And they still have living descendants, but all we have left of them are stone artifacts.
Yeah.
Or pieces of pottery or things like that. And how valuable that little piece of stone becomes because it is autonomous for so many other components of that culture.
Okay, so you have these really underrepresented groups like that. Fundamentally, because they're underrepresented, their stuff is more valuable.
Yeah.
Which is like cool, I guess.
It gets us back to that value conversation, though.
Yes. But then it also means that's got to be frustrating for you. The story you can tell about them with a museum is very limited because you have so little of their stuff.
Yeah. There is a movement right now, which it's a wonderful thing to see, of working with descendant groups in cases like this in particular, talking about the Potawatomi specifically. There are lots of living descendants, and those descendant groups are interested in working with museums to help better represent their story.
Yeah.
We have some incredible stories of African-American settlement in Batavia going back to the 1850s, which is wild.
Yeah. Explain why that's wild.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Illinois in 1850 had a series of laws called the Black Codes, which limited the freedom of movement of African Americans into the state and within the state.
Okay.
So things like you can't congregate in groups of more than 3. That's a crazy rule to have for a specific group of people in what is, quote unquote, a free state, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So there's still all of these restrictions, some of which govern people's freedom of movement within the community. Yeah. So an African-American Black person coming to Batavia to settle prior to the repeal of those codes in 1864 is breaking a series of laws knowingly and seemingly in Batavia with the consent of the rest of the community, right? That like in order for Stephen Smith to build a cabin in Batavia, everybody knows that he's not born here, but they're fine with him living here and are protecting his ability to live here to a certain extent. When we talk about safety, it's a relative safety compared to other places. But in Batavia, the Stephen Smith story, the James Watts story, the William Stewart story are really remarkable because they're really unusual. So getting back to that idea of the one-off instance has value because it is a unique instance. The one-off artifact has value because it's the last one. It's the only thing.
Yeah. Do you feel frustration, though, that you can't tell these stories as well as like
all the time,
like
every day?
A lot of times what comes with privilege and money is this ability to turn your attention toward legacy and all of these things. You can you can give people your stuff. You can be very conscious of it. You set up foundations and all of these things, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't have that, it's a bit more happenstance.
Yes, that is, again, a feature of museums that we're, as a field, working to kind of hopefully skew away from, but that takes really intentional collecting.
Yeah.
We have a room in the museum named after the Van Nortwick family. The Van Nortwick family in Batavia history have absolutely stamped their place in the legacy of Batavia, right? But what sometimes happens is when you're the guy who owns the factory and half of the land, it's easy for you to tell your story compared to the hundreds of men who worked in the factories and their wives who very rarely get a mention anywhere. So you do have these sort of hidden histories or obscured histories or marginalized histories that there's a real interest now in shining a light on that.
Yeah.
Because there's so little material culture remaining, that's a hard job for a museum to tell that story.
And I can't leave this subject because it's hard for me to leave this subject because it's just so, there's so many things popping into my mind that are really matter for Batavia. And I think one of them is this idea of impact.
Sure.
You own a factory, you own all this land, you make an impact on the community, substantial impact on the community. And so in addition to you have more available, you also have more people who want your story to be told, who feel invested in this story being told. I think what people would say to that idea of the factory is like, well, that made a bigger difference to Batavia.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of examples of that, I think, all over any community. How do you think about that tension?
Well, I have a really practical answer for you and then a little more philosophical one. The really practical answer is we have a committee that helps me decide, which is good.
That's good.
We have a committee of folks who form our collections committee. And anytime something comes up as a potential addition to our collection, that goes to a review. There's a bunch of people who take a look at it. There's a lot of pieces of Batavia history that I don't know. And so having someone else who maybe has longer roots in the community, that's a great way for me to not miss things that are really important.
Yeah.
And then a good balance or a counterbalance is me getting to say, this is going to be really hard to take care of for the rest of forever. Is this the best representation of this topic or of this person? Is it the most suitable?
Yeah.
So I get to kind of bring the practicality of like, we can't keep everything. And if we can't keep everything, how do we make those choices?
Yeah.
On a more philosophical level, measuring impact is so hard to do.
Yeah.
There's the impact of John Van Nortwick, who literally built the mill pond and 6 of the 7 factories in town and just had a physical mark on the literal shape of the town.
Yeah.
And then you have the soft impact of somebody from Sweden who came to Batavia and served as a central point in a whole network of immigrants who were coming to town and was the place that everybody went to get their groceries or the place that everybody went to have their dress hems shortened and like had this really human impact that's much harder to trace with the data points that I'm used to looking for.
Yeah.
So that's where that narrative comes in, right?
Yeah, that's so that resonates with me because I had a previous role as like an online magazine editor and like journalism and stuff like that. And in journalism, there's this question of newsworthiness.
Yeah.
And we had someone write up this piece about like a woman who just attended church for years.
Yeah.
Very typical story, but like really impacted the people around her in sort of mundane but profound ways.
Yes.
And I remember the grumbling among the more hard-nosed journalists. Like,
they didn't think it was newsworthy.
This happens all the time. Why are we publishing this story? It was, of course, a feel-good thing.
Right.
I mean, I guess you would call it human interest or something. But that tension of like, this doesn't matter because it's more mundane or more easy or something, doesn't require financial resources in that way.
Yeah. I think that's another thing about Batavia that's really special, though. And I'll point out that we recently did an exhibit that celebrates or explains who all the different schools in Batavia are named after. And this is probably old news to you. Every single one of those schools is named after an educator. They're not politicians. They're not war heroes. They're people who did the day-to-day work of investing in Batavia's next generations, right? Investing in the future. And not just tossing, $1,000 check that direction, but showing up every day and yelling at the kids trying to slide down the banisters at Old West Main Schoolhouse. There's a great story of Grace McWayne, who was a teacher on the west side of Batavia and a principal of the school, and did so much in Batavia, worked with so many kids and families that towards the end of her career, her school board were all kids she had taught. And one of the school board members thought he could get away with, now that he was a big, important school board member, sliding down the banister at the West Side School. And she caught him. And just sort of how human that touch point is, how basic it is. And yet Batavia does not forget that kind of thing. Batavia really likes to celebrate and remember the people who've had that kind of an impact. Doctors who took care of the town, teachers who took care of the kids.
I don't know if this will go in the podcast or not, but this is really of interest to me because you make a podcast about your local town and you do things like this. Eventually you're going to hit a wall and you're going to go, I got to expand somehow.
Sure.
And in what direction do I expand? And I've recently, I've gone into a bit more public figures, I interviewed the mayoral candidates and things like that. But the question I've had in my mind is, do I just start talking to people like that don't have a hook, because multiple people have said, are you going to start talking to just like individual people? Yeah. And I'm like, well, you need my editorial
How
brain.
am I going to sell that?
How am I going to make people care?
Sure.
But I think the opportunity is uniquely there for this community, right? Like, I think there is a feeling of like, and at this point, even before I came here, I'm thinking this is probably the direction I'm going to go, where I'm going to start. I interviewed the Tucsonas a while back.
Great poll.
The way I made them care was Logan Street Baptist Church. I sort of tied it to that, but it was about them and their story.
Yeah.
And those kinds of things, like even people who aren't as historically grounded in the community have incredible stories to tell. I think that's really valuable to sort of give opportunity for people to learn from people who could impact Batavia in ways that are relatable and doable,
Would it be super weird for me to run and grab an artifact really quick?
Go for it.
Okay,
Yeah.
just a second. Stuff in the back here. Okay. I'm gonna make noise on your table. I'm sorry.
All good. Okay, so I'm looking at a binder that says Batavia's Celebrities, 1908 and 09. So this is a giant binder full of celebrities from, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
So this is the
from 2 years
actual book. See that?
Oh, wow. What is this cover made out of?
I don't know. Looks like leather, but
it's just leather,
sort of a
but
suede situation. It's a flocked leather with a lovely stamp. So it's a very typical turn of the 19th into the 20th century scrapbook. This one is one of two copies made by a guy named Leslie Hallbrook and Madge Grimes. Am I getting that name correct? I want to make sure I don't mess up her name. Tracy went around town and photographed everybody he met on the street. And this document is one of the most, when we talk about value, most valuable things in our collection because it's the whole town. It's everybody, all the men.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say,
wouldn't it be great if it was
men here?
Yes, you've got that spot on. But it's not all of the businessmen who could afford to get into the 1888 annual. It's not all of the men who worked at the train or all of the men who worked at the factory. It's just everybody out on the street in Batavia in 1908.
Wow. Yeah.
So the faces that we see here are so, it's such a great snapshot of what the community looked like, age, race, all kinds of different demographics. Style of dress tells us a lot about how much money that person may have had at their command or just style preferences. There's a photograph in here of a guy who's got 2 raccoons, one under each arm. It's great. And so oftentimes when I'm looking for information about people who lived at this time period, this is my only source of information about them.
Yeah.
But it's still such a rich resource. I can tell so much about that person just based on that portrait. So I think it's very similar to what you're talking about is like, how do I decide who's newsworthy? Who goes into the celebrities book?
Yeah.
Who do I decide to interview? As a historian, do them all. Get everyone.
You get a picture of the community.
Yes.
And that makes sense.
Absolutely. So this is an artifact we're working on digitizing right now so that hopefully this is available out to the public in the next couple of years.
Awesome.
Because genealogy is a big part of what we do here. And it's great for people to be like, oh, you've got a picture of my great uncle. Yeah, we do. It's really cool.
I love that. What has being the director of this museum taught you about yourself?
I think it's taught me a lot about the things that I do care about and the things that I'm willing to like strive to make happen. And I do go other places sometimes.
Yeah.
But boy, Batavia is the place. Like Batavia is such a part of my life and where I want to be. And it's more than just, oh, it's comfortable here. It's comfortable because there are people who make it feel comfortable and homey. And there's values that are shared here by the community. And I learned so much about the way my values match the community I'm in by having this kind of work to do.
Have your values always matched this community? I'm asking as someone who's a little bit had some growth areas that have been challenged by this community.
I think, what an interesting question. Yes, there's a real sense of we're here for each other. We've got each other's back. That's always been something that I really care about.
Yeah.
I'm learning to embrace the mutualness of that need. That it is being in community with people means that you are in community with people who you don't agree with about everything. And that does not mean that they're not going to show up for you on a meal train or that they're not going, like, how do you create safety with people who you don't always agree with?
Yeah.
How do you find that comfort with people who you have differences of opinion with? Because you have to figure out how to work together. You have to figure out how to pull in the same direction.
Yeah.
I've been very lucky in most of my career to work with volunteers who are great at giving me chances to grow because there are often things we disagree about or don't share lockstep. It's different than selecting your friend group, right?
Right.
Selecting your town is broader than that.
Yeah.
And what a lovely thing to have a community that challenges you and pushes you and encourages you to look at things from a different perspective. And I do think that's really been of value to me just as a person, as a human being.
I'm thinking about a question that I don't know that I've ever asked explicitly on this podcast of anyone, but it's always in my head at the end.
Okay.
And so it might be hard, but I think if anyone can answer it, maybe you can. I mean, I actually think it's valuable that you're relative outsider.
Sure.
You came here just a few years before me. And so I've been trying to think through this question. Okay. So let me set it up this way.
Yeah.
There's this clear tension between tradition and progress.
Yes.
All the time.
Yes.
It's been a through line on this podcast. People always talking about, usually people lean one way or the other. It came up in a blatant way in the mayoral race.
Sure.
People talk about these things, and I think it's pretty clear everyone has like a nuanced middle perspective. Okay. But the thing that I heard a lot was we need to push Batavia forward while keeping what makes Batavia. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what makes Batavia Batavia. I have a lot of guesses, but when people say that, they're usually pretty vague. And I often think sometimes it's sometimes it's like cultural expectations that aren't always adaptable by everyone. In other words, it's not inclusive. I think sometimes they mean something that's not super inclusive. And then other times I think they mean something that's maybe in their head, but everyone's not aware of. Yeah. In your mind, is there an answer to that question? What does that mean?
What does it mean to move forward and not lose anything?
Well, specifically, what does it mean to keep Batavia, keep what makes Batavia, or what is that thing that we want to maintain when we move forward?
I get the real privilege of attempting to answer that question every day I'm at work. I really do.
Right.
Because that is the question that people have in the back of their heads when they come to a museum that's about a small community, right? Like we are not a railroad museum. We are not a museum of science and industry. We are a Batavia museum. That's all we do. That's all we talk about. So what is Batavia? What makes Batavia Batavia, right? It is a challenging question to try to answer. We've just had this conversation as a community when we were designing the community flag, right? Like what goes on the flag? What means Batavia? What means it?
Yeah.
For me, looking at the story of Batavia from, first of all, just like a data-driven standpoint, when you're looking at a community that is built off of the wealth of the land, right? Like the reason Batavia is here and not a mile north or a mile south is because we had a limestone shelf that provided water power. And boy, did we see that water power and said, we could put factories there. Let's make a mill. Let's make a lumber yard. Let's cut some boards and make some flour and build something. I think from seeing that opportunity, just that sort of innate opportunity here and trying to craft it into something satisfying, I don't know that there's anything that's more Batavia than that. Seeing potential and trying to make it something satisfying. And what satisfying means has changed a lot over time. And when people look at the river now, they see something that is satisfying because they can bike and walk along it and it's beautiful and they can go out and fish. That's something satisfying. There's safety to raise your family here. That's very satisfying. There's the opportunity to take raw materials and build a bunch of wagons and send those wagons all across the United States and make a lot of money doing it and build a beautiful church. And that's satisfying to have made a mark like that. So I think that that's a very personal question. But the opportunity to create something satisfying is so present here. That's a real hallmark of Batavia, I think. Like making a thing better than it was when you got there is a very Batavia thing. Just when you're looking at data points.
And I love that because it's so open-ended. That could mean a lot of different things for different people, but that's a feature, not a bug, in the sense that like all sorts of new things that have sprung up in Batavia, and they are more inclusive than things have been in the past. But it doesn't feel out of place. But what they all have in common is exactly what you're talking about. They're this place that feels good and satisfying when you're in them, which feels obvious. Like, doesn't every community do that? But actually, no. Like, there's a lot of communities that are based on lots of other things, ambition or financial sustainability or growth. And Batavia is really not focused on those in the same way. Depending on who you are, for better or worse. But if you want to feel satisfied or stable or content is the word I would probably use.
Content's great.
This is a place you can do that.
It's very right-sized. And we see that a lot, when I'm looking at the records of, well, why didn't we build a huge new sewer system? Why did it take us 20 years to agree to build a new sewer system at the turn of the century? Well, the concerns were, why do we need this? We're perfectly content here right now where we're at. And the people pushing for it are like, but I'm not as content as I could be if we can get just a little bit bigger, then we can do this other thing. And wouldn't that be great? And don't you like that vision? And like, then we have all these conversations as a community about what provides the best comfort, contentment for the group of us, right? There's also this sort of, so when I'm looking at data points, that's a big thing that I see pop up over and over again is people finding opportunity to find contentment and then settling into that contentment. But then there's also sort of the way we've told the story. that almost always leans towards progress. It's very interesting for a community that values its roots so much. When we tell the story of Batavia, we talk about how progressive Bellevue Place was as an institute for mental health care. Wasn't it great that we had this thing that was ahead of its time? Yeah, we can be really proud of that thing that was a little ahead of its time. Isn't it great that we had an African-American Methodist Episcopal Church 20 years before anybody else in Kane County? Yeah, that's great. We should be really proud of that. So when we're looking retrospectively, we tend to be most proud of the things that push the hardest, which I think is really interesting.
Really interesting, and sort of unlocked something for me where I think I was stretching a little bit earlier. It's the satisfying is inclusive if you want it to be.
Right.
Okay. But you still have to create opportunities.
Yeah.
And I do think like maybe that's intentional. Maybe Batavians fundamentally actually, it's not selfish. They want everyone to feel satisfied in that way or content in that way. Well, and it's not easy. And sometimes you trip yourself up and, you psych yourself out. And sometimes people just aren't good people and or don't have the right ideas. But like, I think in general, it feels like a culture that truly cares about those things.
Yeah, I'll point out that Batavia is historically the kind of place where the guy who owns the factory lives down the street from the guy who works for the factory. There is a closeness that comes from being in proximity, literal proximity to each other. That is something, I don't know, maybe I mourn a little bit living in a society where oftentimes you're just pulling into your garage and closing the door and like nobody sees you until you come out the next day. And something that I really appreciate is, for the most part, unusual in Batavia, that there's not a lot of spaces where even on a cul-de-sac, the kids aren't out playing in the cul-de-sac. Right. Or like, maybe I go into my garage and I shut the door, but Saturday morning I'm at the ballpark and we're at Woodard Field and we're playing Little League all together. Like there is such a need for proximity to create that, like what's good for you is good for me and vice versa. That what would be the point of having, if I'm the guy who owns the Challenge factory, what's the point of having a house that's 20 times larger than the guy who pushes the broom at the end of the day if he's looking at my house every night when he comes home, right? Don't bad. I feel like kind of a heel when that's the situation?
Yeah, because you can't really be content if you're feeling that. Or at least I can't. I have a hard time doing that.
I think that that's a human feature too. Feature, not a bug.
What keeps you up at night?
Oh, gosh. I worry a lot about making sure I'm getting it right, making sure that we're not taking weird steps that, well, so much of it is, oh gosh, I wish I'd saved that thing. I wish I'd saved it because I saw it and I didn't know it was important and now it's important and gosh, I wish I'd saved it. That doesn't happen very often, but it is the constant anxiety, right?
Yes.
I worry about like really mundane things like, what if there's a leak and now everything's wet? So putting systems in place to help make sure that we can respond in those sorts of situations gives me a lot of ease, but that's like super practical stuff. I worry a lot about like just sort of on a philosophical level, coming back a little bit to what you talked about, that like I thought history, or the way that I learned to do history, was to memorize things and to repeat them by rote. And it wasn't engaging and it didn't make me curious. And I rarely like being curious, really like building narrative. There are millions of you in the world doing exactly that, feeling disconnected from their stories because they haven't heard the stories yet, or they haven't heard them in a way that catches. So I worry a lot about making sure that what we're doing here feels satisfying to the people who I'm hoping to reach. Like meeting the mission is really of concern. And then I worry about just, I guess, socially, when we do history, it's very normal to disagree about what a thing means or to disagree about the value that it has. And the way we arrive at an answer to that discomfort or disalignment is to continue to talk to each other and share evidence that you can back up. And that feels like a really hard thing to do in American society today. Just generally speaking, sharing evidence, not feeling personally attacked or not going on like, well, he's a bad person and so his ideas about this are also bad. Let's actually look at the evidence. Let's actually examine that together. And that's something that I worry a lot about when we're talking about how to do history in the future and how do we give things meaning and what meaning do we apply to them. The process of that worries me a little bit.
Is that harder to navigate in Batavia or easier to navigate in Batavia because of all the things we just talked about?
I think it's easier in Batavia.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd much rather do it here at McDonald's with the guys who go have coffee at McDonald's in the mornings than on Facebook. Heaven forbid you have this conversation on Facebook or on social media just in general, because you're getting all kinds of opinions coming in that don't have a stake in the situation. And in Batavia, everybody really wants to hear what you have to say. Yeah. They might disagree, but they want to know what you think. Well,
it's interesting in Batavia, not in Batavia, on Facebook, it's facts and figures and opinions, divorced from story and narrative. It's not humanized. You can see people's icons and you can click through and see their profiles, but that's all information. Yeah. It's not relationship or anything else, So it feels like the in-person piece is really important.
You do not have to have grown up in Batavia to be a member of the If You Grew Up in Batavia Facebook group, which is full of that relationship
I was
stuff.
not aware of this one.
Every time somebody shares something on there, and I follow it because I'm often gleaning interesting little historical tidbits.
Yeah.
The comments, and we get this a little on our Facebook page too, but the comments are so funny to read because it's always somebody tagging somebody else who they went to school with. And they're like, Julie, this is your mom. And it's like, there is still such a sense of rootedness, connectedness in some of those spaces that I think is maybe Batavia triumphing over the algorithm. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To you, what does it mean to belong in Batavia?
When I think about belonging in Batavia, I think a lot about, I have 3 kids who are in all the different levels of the school experience. I've got a freshman, a 7th grader, and a 5th grader. And I think a lot about what it means for every person in their classroom to feel like they have an equal share of the pie and that they're all getting the resources that they need and that they're all getting the supports that they need to find whatever that satisfaction thing is, whatever that contentment is.
Yeah.
And I think this is, to your point about this is not unusual in Batavia. If any one of those kids isn't getting the same fair shake as my kids, that to me feels like not belonging. That feels like a place that I don't belong. If there's that, I want everybody to be getting a fair shake.
Yeah.
I feel a real sense of belonging going down to Limestone in the mornings and seeing 6 people I know down there and just that familiarity of folks and not necessarily people who I know specifically, but watching people do that with each other. Like at the farmer's market, people are meeting up with their friends, or at the concerts, the kids are clustering together in these little groups of friendship and community.
Yeah.
So that's a really long-winded answer to a pretty broad question, but
no, it's good. And what struck me about that first part is how that is something that is not in control of the person we're talking about, of the person who wants to belong. It's not something they can necessarily do.
I know how to go to a school board meeting.
Yeah, you can do something. But yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah. But it is, to some extent, it requires other people caring.
Yes.
And that's really funny because a lot of times I ask that question and I get, it's getting involved. It's and you said a version of that just now, familiarity, going to places where you recognize. But a lot of this stuff is dependent on that first thing.
Yeah.
Feeling like you're allowed to get involved or like you have an opportunity or whatever it is. And so
maybe that's such a baseline thing for me. I'm super involved. I'm here and I do the city clerk thing.
Of course you get involved.
Right. Of course you can get involved. Yeah. And the people who I see around me are also really involved. And Batavia is a place where I do not feel any barrier to that for me specifically. So if I don't like the way that the school, all my kids' classmates are feeling, included or not, that's not a thing I'm just going to watch from over here and be dissatisfied that it's not happening the way I would like it to be happening. I know how to call my school board.
Yeah.
I know how to do that, and I'm not afraid to do it. And I think that's really normal in Batavia. The number of folks who come in here specifically who talk about Mayor Schelke on a first name basis and are going to just call him up and ask a question, super normal. That intimacy of being close to the people who are making decisions is super normalized in Batavia.
Normalized, and also the idea of broadening that circle. is, if not normalized, it's part of the Batavian value system, it feels like.
Well, and you've been to a city council meeting, so you've seen sort of the structure of that.
Yeah.
It's really unusual for people to jump in and talk about issues as the business of the meeting is going on. Most city councils don't operate that way. You have public comment. Everybody gets 3 minutes. You got to put your name on the list. And in Batavia, it's so conversational. It's so much back and forth.
Yeah.
Which has its pros and its cons, but seems to, so far, work here. It's popular, for sure.
Sometimes it can be tricky to define the character of a town. A lot of times, what we think of as community values are really just projections of our own. And that's a tendency that usually ends up in misunderstandings and hurt feelings and a lot of other bad outcomes. I've talked to a bunch of people for this podcast about what makes Batavia, Batavian. When you ask a bunch of people for their opinions on a subject, you're going to find something true, just through noticing patterns and common themes. But it was nice to learn a little bit about what makes Batavia unique, objectively speaking. History isn't destiny. There's no rule that says you have to continue to reenact what you've done in your past. But it can provide clarity about why we are who we are. And we can find out what sort of norms, systems, and structures resulted in the cultural landscape we exist in. That knowledge is what really defines us, whether we acknowledge it or not. And it's what keeps us moving forward and growing as a community without losing who we are. Thanks for listening to Area Code Batavia. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, you should absolutely subscribe to the newsletter. Just click the link in the show notes. Most importantly, if you know someone who would love to hear this podcast, please share it with them. Word of mouth is the best way to grow our community and help more people feel like they belong in Batavia, Illinois. Area Code Batavia is produced by Area Code Audio. It's hosted and produced by me, Richard Clark, with additional production help from Jennifer Clark. Edited and mixed by Matt Linder.